Hello, and welcome back to Impact. That's intervention model with practical applications for classroom teachers, which is for the identification and early intervention for primary level students who are at risk of reading failure. Once again, I am your producer and presenter, Heather Desjardins of the Open Door Educational Services, and this was prepared in consultation with Dr. Maggie Maman of the Learning Disabilities Association of Ottawa Carleton. And welcome to the final session, session 3. So today in session 3, we're going to talk about the components of teaching phonological and phonemic awareness, continued. We still have to look at rhyming, phoneme segmenting, phoneme blending, and phoneme elution. We're going to talk about the teaching strategies for each of those remaining components, including the group activities and games, and we're going to end with our conclusion. So just to review, phonological, phonemic awareness, and the progression starts with the larger words within sentences, narrowing down syllables, then to rhyming, and then you get into the various activities that you do with your phonemes for the phonemic awareness components. So we've done our words within sentence. We've done our syllables. The next logical thing, of course, would be rhyming, but we're not going to do rhyming. We're going to come back to that. And that's because phoneme segmenting, specifically just to focus on that initial sound, is such a fantastic groundwork for rhyming. We teach this first, and then we move into rhyming from there. So to develop the skill, you're going to begin with modeling, showing them, for example, cat starts with the sound k. So you would go cat, k, k, cat. Very important note here. Be extremely careful when you're making those sounds. Do not add that sound to the end of those phoneme sounds. So t is not t, it's t. Do you want to have not m, o, not l? Instead of saying p, you want it to be a nice sharp p. The reason for this is if your student learns that T says T and P says P, when they're trying to sound out a word for reading, they'll go T, A, P, toapa, toapa. It's going to be very confusing, and it makes it far more challenging. Whereas if you make those sounds nice and crisp, T, A, P, then the student can T, A, P, top. And they'll be able to read the word in a much easier way without having all those extra vowel sounds thrown in there. So again, you will model top, t, t, top, so that they know they're focusing on that first sound, and then the student repeats back what you've said. So a very useful tool for helping students to understand this is something called the swoop. So basically, you're going to say the word very slowly, and you swoop your fingers in this left to right from the student's perspective gesture. Say the word slowly, top. And then you would just say, now what's that first sound at the beginning? Top. And so there have that, again, that little visual point to focus in on to represent that first sound. So if they struggle with this, have them watch your mouth very carefully so they can see when it's changing from making the first sound into the next sound. That's a really good visual indicator for the student that the sound is changing. So if we say, for example, the word sleep, sleep, there's a visual change from the first sound to the next sound. Now, sometimes they can still have difficulty because the first two sounds can really blend together, particularly if the first two sounds in a word are consonants. That consonant blend can be hard to pull apart. So if that happens with a student, first of all, you want to acknowledge and say, you know what, that's a really tricky word because those first two sounds are super sticky and they really run together. So let's say that the student said that sleep is the word, and they said soul is the first sound in sleep. Or even something that the words blend together a little more. Let's say the word is steep, and they said st is the first sound in steep. So you would acknowledge that it's difficult and say, let's take that answer and let's put it in its own swoop so we can see the difference between the first sound and the other sound in that answer, because those are two sounds that are really stuck together. So you would go st, just putting those two sounds in the swoop. St. Again, you're giving them that visual. They can watch when your mouth is changing st to the next sound. And if possible, of course, hold on to that sound as long as you can before you change to that second sound. If that was the case, what's the sound we're hearing right at the beginning here? St. They would be able to isolate that it's that s sound. However, sometimes the first sound is a sound that you can't hold on to. It's a sound that goes by very quickly. So let's say that the word is clap. So with clap, if they say the first sound in clap, clap. What's the first sound? The student says coal. You say, you know what? It's another of those ones where those two first sounds stick together. Let's put those two sounds in their own swoop and hear if we can hear which one is which sound. So because you can't hold on to that first sound, it might actually be easier for the student to isolate the second sound first. So it would look like this. Coal. What's the sound that we're having at the end of that? Coal. Ol. Right, it's ol. So now we know that one of the sounds in coal is ol. Let's see if we can catch that first sound. It goes by really quickly, so listen for it right at the very start. Coal. From there, they should be able to isolate and get that k sound by itself. If not, have them do the swoop and interrupt them before they've moved from the k sound onto the ol. So they would go k and stop. You've got it. You just said it. What sound did you just say? And so that way it's stopping them before they get into the next sound. So those are some little error correction tips, because sometimes that is an issue that comes up with students. So for phoneme segmenting, one of the games that you can play, you can do the morning song. So I'm sure you all might know this tune. Good morning, Maggie. Good morning, Pam. Good morning, Daniel. It's nice to see you smile. So in advance, you're going to have your three students picked out. You're going to have your letter of the day picked out. Pro tip, mentally pair those kids' names with the letter of the day to make sure you don't end up with a rude word. You do not want to do that in the moment in front of your class. If you do end up with a rude word, either pick a different letter of the day or pick a different student for that day. And that way you're going to save yourself some embarrassment. Then with the students, you'll work out in advance and say, all right, our first student is Maggie. What's the first sound in Maggie's name? Maggie, Aggie, All right, now what would it be if we replaced with k, Aggie, Kaggie? And you would do that for each of the three students using that same letter of the day. And then the class sings that song, replacing the first sound of each of the three names. So it would look like, good morning, Kaggie. Good morning, Cam. Good morning, Daniel. It's nice to see you smile. Now, nice thing about this little game, it has that first phoneme isolation activity in it, but it also, of course, is a very nice segue into rhyming. So now that we've got that first phoneme isolation, we're ready to actually teach rhyming. So for rhyming, you want repetition, recognition, and rhyming generation. And as I had briefly mentioned in the previous session, some students can do one of these and not the other, or they can do two of them and not one. And even though it seems logically like rhyme recognition is easier than rhyme generation, that's not the case for every student. There are students who can generate rhymes like nobody's business, but they can't recognize them. So just because a student can rhyme off brilliantly doesn't mean that they have the recognition skill down. So again, never assume. Make sure you've verified repetition, recognition, and generation for each of your students for each of those skills. So to teach the concept, we did a really quick and dirty explanation of this when we were talking about the whole concept of teaching versus assessing and practice. But we're going to do it a little more involved now so you can see how you would present this to your class. So you would pick an easy to rhyme word, such as cat. You would segment the first sound from that word, k, at. You would present your new sound, and you would sub that new sound in, at. You would reinforce that we have only changed the first sound and that the rest of the word has stayed exactly the same. And then you would reinforce that that's a rhyme. Hat, therefore, rhymes with cat. However, the additional thing that we're going to need to do is remember with our students working on those phonological phonemic awareness skills, we don't want the letters because then students can use pattern recognition and visually be able to see where a rhyme is just based on the letters. We need to work on their auditory ability to recognize and generate rhymes. So you would do this with blank cards. So to do it this way, you would have your blank card and you would say to the students, okay, this is going to be the word cat. So what's the first sound in the word cat? The students would say k. Perfect. Now we are going to replace k with h. What's our new word going to be? At, hat. Perfect. So because we've only changed the first sound and the rest of the word has stayed the same, hat and cat is a rhyme. Now, let's think up another sound that we can swap in for that first sound. B, bat. Does that rhyme? Yes, it does. And you can go from there. Who can suggest a sound? Let the students think up a sound to swap in for that first sound of the word. And if they say something like g, and the word is gat, that's okay. You say, yeah, it's a nonsense word, but it rhymes. You've got it. And then that is the way to teach that skill of rhyming in a very rules-based, systematic way. So once you've done that, then you can get into your practice activities. And you know, if you search, there's 1,000,001 different practice and activities and games that you can do with rhyming. The thing is, make sure that you're focusing on first that repetition, where they can repeat after you, repeat after another student, repeat words from a song, rhyme recognition, questions like, do these words rhyme? Or here's a list of words, which ones don't rhyme, which ones do rhyme? And then, of course, rhyme generation, questions like what rhymes with, coming up with poems, name 4 words that rhyme, anything that involves them having to actually come up with the words that rhyme. So for our error correction, so this is going to be the students that either give you an incorrect rhyme, or they say two words rhyme when they didn't, or even if they're just not sure and they're kind of, they say it in that tentative voice, yes. So for those, you can use your hands to really reinforce and show them. So let's say you had asked if slop and slip rhyme, and the student either was wrong or they weren't sure. So you can say slop, slip, slop, slip, lop, lip, lop, lip. Are those two the same sound or different? Different? Then that means that those two words don't rhyme, because the sound after that first sound are different. It's not a rhyming word. So this is a really good way for them to isolate the remainder of the word and see if they're the same, and a way that they can internally check as well when they're trying to figure out rhymes and working on that skill. So now we're ready to get back into our phonemes again. So phoneme blending. So with the activities for phoneme blending, it's a very, very similar concept as your compound word and your syllable blending. But because phonemes are more challenging, we're going to be adding in an extra step while you're teaching that skill. So say that you're using the students with the cards. Say that our word is at. You would say to the first student, your letter is ah. The second student, your letter is t. When I point to you, you say your sound. And when I point to you, you say your sound. But then the new step is when I run my hands in this swoop gesture. Then as my hand goes by you, you slowly say your sound, and the two sounds will run together without a space in between. And then after that extra step, then you put your cards together and say the word together. So with that, it would look like ah. The second student says t. They each say very slowly at, and then quick like a word, at. So this can be done with 2 cards, 3 cards, to get to those slightly longer words. Again, when you're initially teaching this skill, I would limit it to the 3 phonemes. But that added step of them blending their sounds together really helps with blending together their phonemes. So say the word was cat, the first student goes k, the next ah, the next t. And then when you do that gesture, cat, and then cat. So you're not always going to have your students holding cards in front of the class. As you're working on this, you can do it as simply as having cutout squares of paper, or with colored chalk on your blackboard, or if you have a smart board, you can have little colored squares. And you're going to say, okay, this one says k, and this square says ah, and this square says t. You have your students repeat that. K, t. Good. Now you're going to slowly run those sounds together. Cat. Okay, now say it all together. Cat. And then they've read that word from the sound that you've given them. Now, a small little thing to keep in mind, if you have a word and that word has the same sound appear more than once, like the word pop, you would say, okay, this sound says p. This one says aw, and this one says p. You could say, I was wondering, why do you think that first sound and that last sound are the same color? And I'm sure you'll have students who are able to figure out it's because it's the same sound. So that reinforces that same sound, same color. And then from there, of course, slowly blend and the word pop. So the error correction process. So some of the problems is that they still pause between the sounds, either between a couple of the sounds or even between all of the sounds. So one thing is actually physically moving those tiles or cards so that they're right next to each other when they're doing that blending phase, so that there isn't an actual visual space behind them. That can actually help. But it is in that slowly blend step that you can work on this error. Now, if just explaining that you want them to blend without having a space in between them and moving them together isn't enough, then tell the student, as you're running your finger under each of the tiles or the cards or whatever it might be that you're using, you're making the first sound and then continue making a sound and move the shape of your mouth to then make the second sound and the third, and you're making a sound without any pause in between. Keep having a sound coming out of your mouth as you switch between making each of those 2 or 3 sounds. If necessary, you can model that for them, ideally using a different word so they can see exactly what you mean, and then be able to work it out with the word that they're actually working on. Now, if that problem persists, then let's say that they're working on the word cat and they're saying k, at, and they're having trouble blending that C and the A together. Then you can say, you know what? Those last 2 sounds, you've got those blending together perfectly. So let's remove that last sound for now and just work on blending together the first 2 sounds. So this one says k and this one says ah. And say the first sound and continue saying it as you run your finger under and move into saying that second sound. And hopefully them only having to focus on blending those 2 sounds, they'll be able to get that ka, ka, ka. And once they have ka, then you can reintroduce that t, which they were able to blend in before without difficulty. So, phoneme segmenting. We already talked about getting that initial sound off, doing it with the final sound and the middle sound. The concept is still the same. You're going to want to use the swoop. A reminder again, always be sure it appears left to right for your students. So likely if you're standing and facing them, you're doing the gesture from right to left for you. So the same concept applies for initial, final, and middle, and that includes the different troubleshooting tips that we talked about as well. So once they can isolate the initial, the final, and the middle sounds, then they're ready to segment all 3 sounds in a word, or all 2 sounds. But at this stage, again, sticking to 2 or 3 sound words is the way to go. So you're going to give them the word. We'll go use our good old cat. And then they will say that word slowly, cat, and then break it into sounds. And this is where the gestures will get a little bit more sharp and pronounced. So you would say, k, so it would look like cat, 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 to create that separation between each of the sounds. So for your error correction, if they do have 2 of those letters sticking together, like I described with segmenting the initial phoneme, again, you can try using that swoop with just the 2 letters that they're having trouble separating out, telling them to focus on the sounds you're making at the front versus the sound you're making at the end. And again, focusing on the shape of your mouth so that they can see when your mouth is changing from one sound to the next. K, ah, t. Your mouth will change shape between each. Sometimes if it's helpful and they're really stuck, you can make sure you're accentuating that change a little bit too. Now, if they are doing the part where they're supposed to be segmenting the sounds and they're still running them together, they're going cat, cat. All you need to do is just emphasize for them you're making 3 separate sounds at the 3 different points and a little pause between each of those sounds. If explaining it to them, what you're looking for, doesn't do the trick, then you can go back to the error correction number 1 here and actually work on helping them separate out the sounds that they're running together. Because they could be running it together just because they don't realize they're supposed to be making the sounds distinctly with a pause between them. Or, of course, they're running them together because they don't really know where one sound ends and the next one begins. Now, a little bonus activity that you can do for phoneme segmenting. At first, you can kind of spoon feed it to them. The word man has 3 sounds. What's the first sound in man? And then make it a little more challenging by removing the step where you segment the word for them. What's the last sound in sun? And then from there, you can actually add in words that even have more phonemes in them. Give them a heads up when you're doing this so that they're not confused, expecting 3 phonemes and they're hearing more and wondering if they're doing something wrong. So you can say, the word train has, 4 phonemes in it. And what's the second sound in train? I just had to double check. It does have 4 phonemes. Yeah, we're good. So what's the second sound in train? Or whatever sound you want in whatever words. Obviously, you still don't want to get into very long words. This is still a developing skill, but that's a little activity that you can throw in to do a little bit more practicing. And then with phonemes, we also have phoneme elution. So to develop this skill, again, very similar to what we've done before, but in this case, we are removing an actual phoneme from the word. So with your students, you would say cup. The student would say cup. All right, now say cup without k, and they would give the answer up. Now initially, maybe in the earlier stages, you need to have them segment the sounds and the phonemes, but hopefully they've developed this skill enough throughout the process of all of the activities you've done that you'd be able to go more quickly into them being able to pull off an individual phoneme and say what's left. Now, again, when you're starting out, start with words that still make a real word once you've taken away a phoneme. It makes it far easier. It makes sense in their brain. So things like cup without k, they'd give up. Meat without t is me. Farm without f is arm, and so on. Now, just remember while you're doing this, this is auditory. So you're saying bold without b. You're giving the sound. You're not saying bold without b. Time without t, as opposed to time without t. This way, they're hearing the sound, removing the sound, and they're not thinking about the symbols of letters, because that, again, is not what we're focusing on while we're working on these phonemic skills. Now, once they've been able to do this and they've got some practice, you can start using words that when you take away a phoneme, what's left over isn't a real word. But again, we're not trying to trick them. Give them that heads up and let them know, okay, the next ones that we do, when we're taking out a sound, what's left behind isn't going to be a real word. It's just going to be like a nonsense word, and that's okay. And so then you can move on and give them some words. Toy without t is oi. And stamp without p is stam. Again, also always careful to make those sounds really clearly and properly. So if we go back to the beginning, we look at that foundation with the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness being such a critical base and foundation for reading and spelling, and how once those are solidly in place, you can do phonics and so on. Now that you've got these skills and now that you've got your students that are able to do these different activities, if you essentially blend the activities from phonemic awareness with phonics, then you are on an amazing path towards your students really succeeding with reading. So instead of your blank cards, you're going to now, instead of dictating the sound, you're going to have the card with a letter on it, and they will get the sound by looking at the letter on the card. So instead of saying, this card says k, and this card says ah, and this card says t, you would just show them, and they would know from the letter on the card from their phonics, this says k, and this says ah, and this says t. And then they would run those sounds together and read the word cat. And as for spelling, same idea. You would give them the word, let's use top, and then they would use their phonemic awareness segmenting skill to say, okay, top, t, ah, p. And then they just write down t, ah, p, and they'd write down each letter to represent the sounds that they're saying. So it's blending those two together that you get that reading and spelling success. So our conclusion, you want to spend at least 10 minutes every day reviewing these skills. So starting off with the order that we had with your counting words and syllables, but as they have gone through and they've learned each of these skills, you can mix up the focus as you're adding those skills to their repertoire. Maybe one day you're doing some work with syllable segmenting, and the next day you're doing some work with phoneme blending and then elution, and mixing it up, but making sure every day they're practicing, they're being exposed. And of course, you are watching and have your little checklist handy so you can see who's getting it, who isn't. When possible, if someone's struggling, offer them that one-on-one, that teaching, the error correction, things like that. But also, you'll know which students to flag as students of concern, which ones might need some help beyond what you're able to do in your busy classroom. And then hopefully that student can receive some extra support and help, and the right kind of help, not leveled readers trying to get them reading practice, but help with securing the phonological and the phonemic skills that they need to have before they tackle reading. Those need to be there first. And if they're struggling, then the help they get should be in phonological and phonemic awareness. Very, very important. So, your takeaways from this whole thing. Hopefully there's quite a few of them, but some of the key ones I'll highlight. The fact is, students are at risk. They're at risk of reading failure, and they're at risk of some very difficult times on the path that they could be heading down. But the big shining highlight, you have the amazing opportunity to change that path for these students, to change their entire lives. So watch for those warning signs. Never assume. Unless you are positive they have that skill down, don't assume they do. The takeaways that we discussed, phonological and phonemic awareness, the role that it plays in reading, how incredibly important it is, and that it is an auditory skill, keeping that in mind. And then that whole concept of teaching versus assessment and practice, that with teaching, you are explicitly in a rules-based way teaching the skill versus the assessment and practice where you're reinforcing, playing games, asking questions. Then again, we also have assessing and tracking those phonological and phonemic awareness skills with your checklist. This is your tool to make sure you don't have those students slipping through the cracks. They only get that check mark when you know they've got it. And then the takeaway, of course, of all of those different strategies that we discussed for teaching and practicing, each of those skills in the phonological and phonemic awareness skill set. We've covered a lot of information. You can go back and review these videos as many times as you need to and take those notes. But I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I hope that you're able to apply what you've learned to your classrooms. Take care.